let's begin. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Katarzyna to you all, assistant professor, Department of English Studies in Drama, Theatre and Film in the Institute of English Studies of University of Łódź in Poland. Her research interests mostly oscillate around cultural disability studies. She collaborates with Theatre 21 Foundation and Warsaw's Down Center of
Downtown?
Downtown, sorry, Center for Inclusive Art, sorry. She has translated Rosemary Galan-Thompson's book Starring, How We Look into Polish, and the Polish title is Gapienie się, czyli o tym, jak patrzymy i jak pokazujemy z siebie innym, published by Theatre 21 Foundation in 2020. And she also co-edited together with Maciej Wieczorek, a collection of essays entitled Disability and Consensus, Strategies of Disability Representation and Inclusion in Contemporary Culture, published by Brill in 2020 as well. She's now working on a book project under a tentative title, Recovering from Social Amnesia, Commemorating Lives Unworthy of Life in Contemporary Cultures, and she's also translating Tobin Sieber's Disability Aesthetics into Polish. And Kasia was also an organizer of one of the first conferences, academic conferences in Poland devoted to disability studies. And that's where we met.
Exactly.
So Kasia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Magda. Thank you so much for this generous introduction. And I should start by saying that I'm really delighted to be here. And as Magda has mentioned, we're meeting in a hybrid format for the very first time. So kudos to the organizing team. Thank you for making this event possible. And thank you all for coming or joining us online. And today I would like to share a small part of a larger project which centers on the ways in which disabled victims of the Nazi regime are commemorated in contemporary cultures. And I will briefly focus on three cultural contexts: the Polish context, the German context, and the American context that is part of what I would call Western/Anglophone disability culture. And I will talk a lot about Poland because, well, our research platform focuses on Eastern Europe. But when discussing the other two contexts, my major focus will be on selected strategies used by members of disability communities, as well as their ally strategies that aim to rescue this part of history from oblivion and challenge the perception of certain alternative ways of being and functioning in the world, as less valuable, as less worthy, and thus disposable. So let me start with some historical background of the Nazi euthanasia program. And obviously I'm using the word euthanasia in inverted commas, as it literally means good death, and the murder had nothing to do with that. And the program officially started in October 1939, when Adolf Hitler issued a letter in which he authorized what he called mercy killings of those who had been deemed incurable. And it paved way for Action T4, a secret program of the mass murder of German and Austrian psychiatric patients whose name derives from the address of the coordinating center, Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin. And Hitler's letter was backdated to 1st September 1939, the date of the German invasion of Poland. And this kind of hints at one of the goals that the killing campaign was to achieve, namely the redistribution of resources. An idea that, as it was believed, German society would be more willing to accept at the time of war. And let me illustrate this with some propaganda posters. The first one informs us that the daily costs of care for a disabled individual equal the cost of living of a healthy family of 5. While the other, informs us that the care for a person with hereditary impairments over the lifetime costs 60,000 Reichsmark. And yet, as philosopher Georgia Agamben notes, the ultimate goal of the program was different. More specifically, Agamben argues that it was a step towards changing the Third Reich into a biopolitical state that exercises full power over the population and its physical composition. In other words, Action T4 was to legitimize the power of the state to determine who is allowed to live and who is not. And the science of eugenics was supposed to provide seemingly objective criteria for the evaluation of human life based on which such decisions were to be made. So the planned systematic extermination started with the children who were deemed to be defective or incurable. And the Führer created a special committee whose aim was to gather data from local medical staff about impaired children and impaired newborns. And later on, these reports were sent to a reviewing team whose role was to decide whether the child was to live, to die, or to be sent to a special ward for observation. And many of these children were killed, often with luminal or morphium scopolamine. And soon afterwards, the killings were extended to adult patients of psychiatric institutions. And like the murder of the children, it was a highly bureaucratized and compartmentalized process of mass extermination. So the killing machine was composed of numerous replaceable cogs and resembled an assembly line in which the responsibility for the final product was dispersed among all those involved in the process, rather than resting on a single individual or a single group. And the patients labeled as life unworthy of life or useless eaters were killed in Germany, in Austria, as well as in numerous institutions in Poland, and in some areas of what is now Belarus, the Czech Republic, Latvia, Lithuania, and Ukraine. And the patients were shot. They were killed in gas chambers, either stationary or mobile gas chambers, the so-called gas vans. They were killed with drug overdoses or by neglect. And there's no evidence that the killings outside Germany and Austria were in any way coordinated by the center in Berlin. But some historians suggest that they had been planned locally. And yet these murders were connected, not least through the transfer of the killing technologies. So already in October 1939, the Nazis first used a gas chamber to mass exterminate the psychiatric patients of a Polish hospital in Nowinska. And well, the gas chamber still exists in Fort 7. It is a kind of a red brick building. It's kind of resembles some storage space and has a heavy metal green door. And subsequently, this method of killing was adopted in 6 Action T4 killing centers in Germany and Austria. And when Action T4 was officially suspended in August 1949, as it could no longer be kept secret and had met with some open resistance from society, the killing technology and some of the Action T4 stuff were transferred to concentration and death camps in the occupied territories in the east, to places such as Bełżec, Treblinka, or Sobibór. So while it is estimated that around 300,000 disabled people lost their lives as part of this program of mass extermination of psychiatric patients in Germany and Austria, the total number of disabled victims is hard to assess. This is also because long after August 1941, certain extermination practices were still maintained in many mental institutions. So their patients were overdosed with barbiturates, or they died of hunger as a result of the so-called starvation diets. Also, the total number of psychiatric patients who were exterminated in all occupied territories is hard to estimate. So in Germany, the names of the disabled victims who lost their lives as part of Action T4 were for many decades kept secret. So until quite recently, the victims were mostly nameless numbers and their medical files were classified as confidential. And as Andreas Hechler, whose great-grandmother was killed in Hadamar in 1941, explains, and this is a quote, according to federal archive law, subject files are accessible to the public after 30 years. If this access does not adversely affect a third party or that party's personal rights. End of quote. So this shows that operating under the guise of medical confidentiality, the policy was informed by strong prejudice against intellectual disability and mental illness, which remained a source of shame and stigma many years after the war. It was only in August 2018 that the German State Archive officially published a list of around 30,000 names of the victims of Nazi euthanasia, which is like 10% of the whole list of names. And this has been considered by some the first step towards officially recognizing the victims as persons, as human subjects, as individuals. And David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder see this as part of what they call post-humanist memorialization. And post-humanism, as such, challenges the traditional Cartesian definition of a human being, which relegated some individuals as, and most notably those who do not fit in the rational or intellectual norm, to the margin of the human community. And thus post-humanist memorialization of the victims of Action T4, quote, seeks to actively counter the stigma associated with inclusion in the Nazi killing program. So pity towards incurable patients is replaced with empathic unsettlement towards individuals who had their own names, had their own histories and material existence. And empathic unsettlement is a term coined by historian Dominic Lecapra, which denotes a somewhat discomforting kind of empathy. And this discomfort comes from a sense of alertness and unease about the past and its relationship with the present. And as such, it strongly resonates in Suzanne Knittel's concept of the historical uncanny. And here's how Knittel defines it. It is the vertiginous intrusion of the past into the present, the sudden awareness that what was familiar has become strange. And then Knittel continues, a site of memory may be said to be uncanny when it unexpectedly extends into the present, forcing a person or group to reevaluate their understanding of who they are and where they come from, end of quote. So the historical uncanny can thus be seen as a kind of a vehicle for critical reflection and action. So having said that, let me return to the German context in which revealing the names of the victims was just a first step towards post-humanist memorialization. The next step consists in unearthing and retelling the stories of those who were murdered and trying to reach beyond the Nazi medical files and focusing on stories preserved often in families and the scarce material remains. Let me give you an example. This slide shows pencil drawings by Wilhelm Werner, who was diagnosed with idiocy and gassed in Pirna Sonnenstein in 1940. And the drawings show Werner's forced sterilization in a very unique, idiosyncratic style, which is somewhat grotesque and highly ironic. So the first picture presents the author with a cone hat on his head. He's presented as kind of a clown, a jester, a puppet in the hands of the nurse who stands right next to him and who quite literally cuts his testicles. And the next drawing presents a bus with some patients inside the bus. It is like richly decorated with a swastika flag and a large sign sterilization, which kind of mocks Nazi propaganda. And again, we see the nurse sitting on the roof of the bus, at the top of the bus, right next to a gramophone, and she's playing with two testicles served on a plate. And right next to it, there is a book cover. This is a very recent book whose title translates into English as Heaven Full of Silence. It was written by Julia Guilford and tells the story of Guilford's grandfather, who was a musician, a composer, and a conductor. And he was forcibly institutionalized after a mental breakdown, and later on he was exterminated as part of Action T4. And Guilford's work is just one of many examples of biographical research that has been conducted by people who want to find out more about their largely forgotten family members. And some tremendous work in this field has also been done by Robert Partzer, who is the founder of Gedencourt T4 website and blog. The slide shows a screenshot of the website. And Partzer and his working group have been publishing the victims' biographies and supporting various commemorative and participatory initiatives since 2011. And in 2012, the year after the German parliament voted on the creation of a new memorial at Tiergartenstrasse, the Gedencourt T4 working group announced their own competition called Andersartig Gedenken, which means remember differently. And it was a competition for teenagers who were asked to design their own memorial of the victims of Action T4. And this art contest gave way to another contest under Andersartig Gedenken on stage, which has become a kind of a regular thing, a regular event. And it is addressed to secondary schools and integrational theater companies that include actors with disabilities and particularly intellectual disability. And they're asked to tell the stories of the victims on the stage. But Andersartig Gedenken on stage is more than just a contest. It is also a kind of educational undertaking because the working group, Gedencourt T4, they offer workshops for theater groups that intend to take part in the contest. Those groups can also take a tour of one of the memorials in Brandenburg with a team of guides, one of whom is a person with intellectual disability. And they also get access to victims' biographies in simplified German. So in this way, Andersartig Gedenken on stage has done a lot to make the stories of disabled victims of National Socialism heard, as well as empower members of disability communities to reclaim their collective history. And the question of including people with disabilities in the visual remembrance has also been central to Kellerkinder. It is a Berlin-based self-advocacy organization of people who define themselves as people with psychological barriers, which others refer to as mental illness. And many of them also see themselves as psychiatric survivors. And and Kellerkinder have been running a number of projects that combine art and activism, and that seek to introduce the rule "nothing about us without us" to commemorative practices. And a significant part of their work centered on reclaiming the memory of Action T4. And it was a response to the absence of individuals with mental impairments at the official events organized at Tiergartenstrasse, which the members of the organization attended uninvited in 2014. And later on, they also visited various memorial sites, the former killing centers. Actually, as they put it, they peacefully occupied these places. Yep, and in general, Keller-Kinder states that they identify with the victims of Nazi eugenics and euthanasia, and that they see their history as their own, in other words, the history of their own community. But they also highlight that the oppression of people with disabilities today should not be simply equated with that suffered by the victims of the Nazi regime. And yet, the past and the contemporary social norms and values that deem some forms of being and functioning in the world as less worthy are in some ways comparable. So reclaiming history and memorialization serve as tools to help build collective memory and identity, as well as trigger empathic unsettlement and an uncanny feeling that the legacies of the eugenic past are still with us. And finally, much work in the field of participatory culture of remembrance that includes people with mental disabilities was also done at the beginning of the 21st century by Jutta Georg at Hadamar. And her ideas serve as an important inspiration for many other memorial centers. For instance, Brandenburg, which is very close to Berlin. And since 2017, the Brandenburg Memorial has been organizing tours and workshops in simplified Germans. They have been also employing tour guides with learning disability. And this photo shows two members of the educational staff at Brandenburg Memorial, Clara Mansfeld and Christian Marx, and two of the participants in a workshop organized for people with intellectual disability who were later on employed as tour guides, as Kirsten Latzke and Nicole Pietschmann. And in Brandenburg, the inclusive practices were developed in 2016 when they started a project that included a training course for people with intellectual disability. And it was organized in collaboration with Kai Langstengel. Kai Langstengel is a theater director who for many years collaborated with Rambazamba, which is a Berlin-based and internationally recognized theater company of actors with intellectual disability. And as part of the workshop, the participants were given an opportunity to explore the history of the plays at their own pace in a safe, accessible space that didn't resemble a traditional hierarchical class, especially that many of them had some bad memories of their past school experience. And the very structure of the training course sought to empower them to fully reclaim their history on their own terms and in their own ways. So Marx and Mansfeld compare the structure of the course to kind of a network with 6 central points of reference, 6 general topics that the participants could explore in the order and the way that they found most convenient, thus paving their own path through the network of data. So the project facilitated turning the memorial site into an inclusive participatory space. And in Poland, the members of local disability communities most often have not been included in memorial and remembrance practices. And throughout years, most of the commemorative strategies have been dominated by what I would call the medical and the martyrological perspectives. And this is largely connected to the fact that much of the research on the extermination of Polish psychiatric patients has been done by Polish psychiatrists and historians of medicine. And the work was started by Zdzisław Jaroszewski, a psychiatrist who secretly witnessed the deportation of patients from the psychiatric hospital in Awinska in 1939. And he also edited the first very comprehensive in some ways, work on the extermination of psychiatric patients in Poland. And it was published in 1989, and it consists of 2 volumes. One volume is a kind of a very long list of patients and medical personnel who were exterminated by the Nazis. And the other volume centers on the history of very specific institutions, rather than on the history of the victims. And the title of these 2 volumes is Pacjenci i pracownicy szpitali psychiatrycznych w Polsce zamordowani przez okupanta hitlerowskiego i los tych szpitali w latach 39–45. So Jaroszewski's work set the direction for the future research conducted by few Polish psychiatrists and historians of medicine, whose work does involve some biographical research, but it focuses on psychiatrists, mostly the heroes who showed some resistance, or the few villains who eagerly collaborated with the Nazis. While it can be argued that, in fact, the majority of the medical staff were neither. They were rather bystanders. And Artur Hojan, the co-founder of the T4 Association, now based in Berlin, also argued that Polish psychiatrists and historians of medicine tend to construe a somewhat idealized image of Polish medicine and psychiatry, and also society in general, in opposition to the evil other, the Nazi Germany, making a very clear-cut distinction between the victim nation and the oppressor nation. And in general, I think that one might risk a statement that in the official Polish memorial culture and historiography, there has been little space for stories that kind of complicate this black and white picture, as best exemplified by the controversy caused by Jan Gross's work on Polish participation in the Holocaust. And as regards disabled victims, there is also this widely held belief that it is impossible to research the biographies of the victims because there is nothing left, which is not entirely true, though numerous, or perhaps even most of these stories may indeed have passed away together with the victims' family members, but this didn't happen to all of them. So when I started doing some research onto this topic, but back in 2018, I visited the museum. This is what I found there, kind of an old-fashioned wooden wheelchair from a mental hospital in Kocborowo, located like 60 kilometers away from Gdańsk. And right next to this exhibit, there is interactive display case, and you could learn some information about the extermination of psychiatric patients by the Nazis. It also includes some specific stories of some specific victims from Kocborowo, mostly children, and these stories were illustrated with the photos of these children and some excerpts from letters from some concerned parents who didn't know what happened to their children. And back then, I didn't know that much of this was published much earlier in Poland in the late 60s in Krystyna Szwendnerowa's book entitled Zbrodnia na Via Mercantorum. Here the slide shows the book cover, dark book cover with some burnt fence. The English title of the book is The Crime on Via Mercantorum, and examines the stories of the patients from the hospital in Kocborowo. And the project was started 20 years earlier by Szwendnerowa's husband, Stanisław Krzysztof Szwendner, who found some hospital records in the basement of the hospital in Kocborowo. And he was planning to write a book, but he passed away, and it was his wife who brought this project to completion. And to my mind, Zbrodnia na Via Mercantorum is unique for number of reasons. So first of all, it mentions the names and the stories of a number of Kazborova's patients. And apart from facsimiles of official documents, it includes photographs, mostly of children, and all of them are signed, at least with the name of the child. And it also shows the patient's disabilities as their peculiar, idiosyncratic features, or a result of the disabling influence of the environment. And one of the examples is Augustin Krzyża, probably the most famous patient, who was also the first victim exterminated by the Nazis. He was a man with some intellectual disability, and he was institutionalized after he killed his employer. So he could easily be dehumanized, and he could easily fit into this model of a dangerous, disabled other, mental other. And it's in Schwentnerowa's book, he's described as a kind of likable person who is clever, who is shrewd, who soon adapts to the hospital environment and becomes quite a popular figure, very well known for various pranks. So in general, rather than social outcasts and misfits, the patients are shown as valuable members of the hospital community, as well as family networks, as evidenced by hundreds of desperate letters from the families, which Schwentnerowa quotes in her book. And it seems that there may be many more such stories to be heard, stories which have been preserved in Polish families. Schwentnerowa, for instance, mentions that the daughters of another patient, Antoni Klonowski, know the tragic history of their father almost by heart. And I would just like to briefly mention one more story, the story of yet another patient, Jerzy Fabianowicz, who is also mentioned in Schwentnerowa's book. And this story was used by the authors of a recent film, Spengaw's 1939. They were looking for some witnesses of the events in Kocborowo, and they got in touch with Jerzy's brother, Mieczysław, who shares his story and the story of his brother in the film. So it seems that these stories exist, but they're kind of hidden in family closets. And creating a space where one can speak and be heard kind of rescues these stories from oblivion. And I also have an impression that in recent decades, the marginalization of disabled victims in Poland has been noticed also by members of the medical circles who have been researching the extermination of psychiatric patients. And one of the ways in which this problem has been addressed was to try to blend the stories of the victims with the dominant martyrological narrative. So, in other words, to try to reimagine the victims as brave individuals who sacrificed their lives for their homeland. And in this context, I think I should mention that the work done by Jaroszewski has been continued by another psychiatrist, Tadeusz Nasierowski, who together with a team of collaborators launched the Broken Silence Project. It is a fundraising campaign to erect a monument in the place where Warsaw's former psychiatric hospital of St. John of God once stood. And the hospital was an important site of Polish resistance during the Warsaw Uprising. And it was destroyed in a bomb attack in which around 300 people were killed. And as we learn from an article published in 1949 by Adolf Falkowski, who was the commander of the hospital during the uprising, the clinic offered emergency assistance to the wounded. And Falkowski mentions that the patients made splints and crutches for the wounded, and they also helped take care of the injured. And the Broken Silence Project alludes to this testimony. But when you visit the website, what's striking about it is that there is a subsection on the fate of Polish psychiatrists and psychiatry in general. There is also a section titled In Defense of the Patients, with 2 short biographical notes of 2 psychiatrists who died and are presented as heroic figures. But if we approach this project and the way it is presented from the perspective of critical disability studies, project seems problematic, at least for 2 reasons. So first of all, the patients remain in background. And secondly, the website brings together 2 hardly compatible elements. On the one hand, we've got the story of a heroic fight, and then an image of a medicalized, weak, and inferior Ada. So on the one hand, the website inscribes the victims into the popular patriotic, heroic, martyrological narrative, as it mentions the common fate of, quote, mentally ill people and those who were healthy, who together fought and were killed by German invaders at this very hospital. It also acknowledges the fact that disability is one of many features that are frequently used as grounds for stigmatization. But on the other hand, the victims are addressed from a non-disabled and somewhat patronizing perspective as completely powerless and defenseless. And this is most conspicuous in such statements as the concluding line of the text, which is evidently addressed to an able-bodied viewer, and that is to be inscribed on the monument. And this is what it says. Let us remember that our attitude to people with mental issues is the marker of our humanity. Or another excerpt from another section of this website. With our initiative, we wish to commemorate as defenseless victims as it is possible to imagine. But the reader is not in any way encouraged to reflect on the complex causes of such defenselessness, which are not limited to impairment, but include such societal factors as the stigma attached to mental impairment and the docility of that is part of the role of psychiatric patient. In 2017, Nasiorowski curated an exhibition presented at the first Congress of Mental Health in Poznań. And in the catalogue of the exhibition, he included a number of archival photos of the patients from various Polish institutions. So these patients, they're still nameless patients, and they're shown in group photos, in some everyday situations, at workshop, at school, in the garden, dancing or performing gymnastics, or in some more medical setting, in bed after a medical procedure, or what seems to be solitary confinement. So the patients kind of resembles ghosts that hound the patients, the pages of the catalog. And what makes their presence a bit more substantial are fragments of witness testimonies selected by Nasiorowski. And in these testimonies, the patients are shown as a group that has its place in the traditional Polish martyrological narrative. Ludwik Dudek, an orderly at the Kobierzyń Hospital, recalls that some of the patients deported from the asylum to their doom cursed the Nazi soldiers, while others sang the Polish anthem, which is a powerful act of resistance that was initiated, to Dudek's surprise, by female patients. But a completely different image of psychiatric patients emerges from the fragments of testimonies given by insurgents who fought in the Warsaw Uprising and who spent some time at the St. John of God Hospital. For instance, Stanisław Lechmirowicz writes that, quote, "Total the lunatics howl as jackals. In the corner, naked women covered in blood huddled together, dirty, disgusting bodies. Upon seeing a nun, the female lunatics despairs with a strange, somewhat bird-like squeak," unquote. And he also comments on the dress code, which he finds deeply problematic, as at times he easily confuses the patients with the stuff, and this clearly produces a sense of discomfort in Lechmirowicz. And he seems to be particularly disturbed by the behavior of female patients, as this behavior doesn't really fit in the generally acceptable model of female propriety or modesty. But as regards the male patients, whom Lechmirowicz sees as much calmer, well, he states that nurses use them to do various tasks which they allegedly perform very well. Orderly Janina Kruczyńska-Fojucka recalls that after the hospital was bombarded, she saw the ill with chunks of flesh hanging at their feet who tried to escape from the ruins. And as she explains, and this is a quote, "We then started to evacuate the wounded. We didn't evacuate the ill because they were already doomed to," and the sentence is left unfinished. So the question of whether they were considered to be doomed to die because of the severity of their wounds, or whether they were left to die because of their mental impairments, is left unanswered. And these testimonies serve as shocking evidence of ableist attitudes towards psychiatric patients whom the insurgents perceived as the mental other, at best awkward and strange, and at worst disgusting, dangerous, and inferior. And yet these testimonies are presented without any commentary that would flesh this out. Thus one cannot help the impression that these excerpts have been included in the catalogue not so much to critically address social attitudes to psychiatric patients, but rather to serve as a background against which the decision of one of the doctors to stay in the shelter with her patients appears truly heroic. So from the final testimony, we learned that a few days before the bombardment, Polish soldier Zenon Klimkowski met a doctor, whom Nasirowski identifies as probably Halina Jankowska, and he encouraged her to escape and save her life. And the woman answered that she would never leave her patients. So in Poland, what remains largely conspicuous by its absence is the participation of members of disability communities in the commemoration of the victims. And this particularly concerns people of intellectual disability. And for this reason, I would like to briefly discuss one exception to this absence, namely the 2015 performance Tisha B'Av by the Warsaw-based Theatre 21, the only Polish professional theatre company of actors with intellectual disability. And allusions to Action D4 in this particular performance are very subtle. And the performance is indebted to the view that Action D4 should be considered a prelude to the Holocaust, which is conspicuous in the title, as well as the fact that originally it was staged at the Polish Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, in the room, in a room that is next to the room housing the Holocaust gallery. And the performance as such resembles a physical education class in which the actors dressed in impeccably white gym wear performed some gymnastics, which was very popular in Nazi Germany. It was closely connected with the cult of athletic, beautiful Aryan body. When entering the room, the audience are given headphones through which they can listen to the pre-recorded memories of the actors' mothers. And the women talk about the first moments after they gave birth to a child, and they learned that the child has Down syndrome. And these stories present a kind of a journey from social ostracism and alienation to love, acceptance, and sense of community. But there is also an ironic twist at the very end, because one of the mothers says that she's glad that her daughter has Down syndrome because she will never leave her. Right, so the strong bond with the child turns into a slightly toxic relationship that traps the daughter in the role of an eternal child and a dependent subject. And afterwards, the actors play some games whose underlying principle is the elimination of the one who is less fit, who is less lucky, who's slower. In other words, it's all about eliminating the weakest link. And at first, the games may seem trivial or even funny. They provide some comic relief, but well, it soon appears that the laughter is never innocent. It's never laughing with another. It's always laughing at another. So, and this is largely because these games have been designed for non-disabled bodies, and their fixed exclusionary rules build a strong sense of competition. And the actors themselves explain that they don't like these games as they do not match their bodies and their abilities, but they had to play them at school or in the playground. And what is also very telling is the fact that the final game was dodgeball, in which the person hit with the ball had to leave the stage and the room, and they would never return to this room, even for the applause. So even the winner enjoyed a very, very short success and was taken off stage by one of the coaches. And that was the end of the performance, after which the actors did not return to the room. So in this way, dropping out of the game suggested ultimate elimination. Trivial stigmatizing games gradually changed into extermination. So the performance does not very explicitly commemorate the victims of Nazi murder, but rather uses the tragic past as an uncanny context that helps show that many of the values that informed the Nazi eugenics are still present in contemporary society and inform its exclusionary rules. And I think that it's important here to mention that Action T4 is becoming an important factor, important event in history that shapes Polish disability identity. And recently I had the pleasure to listen to a workshop by Magda Szerota and Natalia Pamuła, and which also kind of tackled Action T4. And there was this one attendee who's also a person with disability. And one thing that he mentioned was that there are a few things that can awaken one's identity more powerfully than knowledge about Action T4. Kind of stayed in my memory. But this is obviously not limited to Poland. And I believe that Action T4 has become part of the transnational memory of disability communities, which is, I think, quite evident in many countries, including the US and also the UK. So with this in mind, and very brief final part of this talk, I would like to just very briefly turn to the perspective on the victims of Action T4 offered by members of Western disability communities, who often use their own experience and what is sometimes referred to as crip expertise, so kind of knowledge coming from the first-hand experience of disability, to present this part of history from their own perspective and often reimagine the lives of the victims. Reclaiming the memory of Action T4 by the disability community is obviously a very, very broad topic and a complex topic, and I won't be able to address many important things today, but I would just like to briefly mention the non-fictional work that I find particularly important and productive in the context of the commemoration of the victims of Action T4. And it is the work of some American disability studies researchers who study Nazi eugenics and euthanasia, and who often identify themselves as persons with disabilities, and whose work combines the professional and the personal. And this concerns the work done, for instance, by Rosemary Garland Thompson, but also David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder, and Kenny Fries and Perel. And in the year 2001, Mitchell released a film titled A World Without Bodies, which documents their journey, the journey that they took together with their children to one of the former killing centers, to Bernburg. And watching the film, the viewers follow a group of people who identify themselves as disabled on what they call a secular pilgrimage, whose aim is to commemorate the largely forgotten victims and to develop a deeper understanding of Action T4. And it is also compared to a kind of a roots journey, and it's likened to, quote, African Americans going back to investigate slavery, unquote. And they also kind of redefine the role and the presence of disabled bodies and in the memorial, in space of the memorial. So they're no longer patients or victims, but those who take control over the site of remembrance and who narrate its history for the viewers. When analyzing A World Without Body, German scholar Gesine Wegner argues that the film presents Nazi euthanasia victims as kind of a nameless mass because the names of the victims are blurred. And she also argues that the film uses the iconography of the Holocaust in which the victims exist as nothing more than a huddled mass. And yet I would argue that the film offers some precious glimpses of the victim's individuality, which emanates from the photos taken outside the medical setting. Here's one of the photos that is shown in the film. It presents the children who are the patients of one of the killing centers. And their individuality is underscored by means of camera closing up on individual faces. And the photo is juxtaposed with Emma Mitchell vigorously rolling towards the camera. And then the narrative comments, and this is a quote: "When I looked at this photo, I saw my daughter. I saw beautiful children, stubborn children, children who might say, like she does, let's get out of this scary castle," unquote. So the narrator, Snyder, thus instructs the viewer how to look at the photo and experience empathic unsettlements. And here I'd just like to briefly mention that a few years ago, the Snyder Mitchell family traveled to, again, to numerous sites in Germany, in Austria, and in Poland. And they conducted a number of interviews with specialists in the field. And now they're working on another film, Disposable Humanity, a part of which has already been screened, but it's still in the making. And I think that the film will be quite interesting to see, actually very interesting to see when it's out, as it will both trace the private path of the family towards a fuller understanding of Action T4, and also present the changes that have taken place in public remembrance and commemoration over the years. And the idea of a secular pilgrimage, a kind of a ritualized repetition of a journey to a place of historical importance to a community, was also central to the project entitled The Three Graces Visit the Gas Chamber, the Aesthetics, Rhetorics, and Bioethics of Disability in the Museum, which Rosemary Garland Thompson presented a few years ago at a Holocaust conference in St. Louis in the US. And the Three Graces are three female disability scholars who also have different impairments and who define themselves as persons with disabilities. And what I found particularly striking about the project was that when Garland Thompson introduced this project at the conference, she talked a lot about her personal experience doing some research at Hadamar and the Bundesarchiv in Berlin. And she described that in terms of an encounter with the victims that she got to know from the few, quote, traces left of them in the material world, unquote. And she used the word pintamento, which in fine arts means the emergence of the original version from a palimpsestic work, so a work that's been painted over several times. And yeah, so she used it to describe the emergence of individuals from a faceless and nameless crowd, quote, obscured at first by diagnostic categories, official documents stamped with the lurid Nazi swastika, and narratives of pathology, unquote. So in this way, the project kind of shows and uses disability expertise as a source of tools that help reinterpret the lives of the victims and the material remains of these lives. And finally, the notion of a pilgrimage and using one's own experience of disability to reinterpret the lives that the Nazis labels as unworthy of life is also central to Kenny Freese's work. And of course, I'm referring to here to the yet unfinished memoir, which centers on his research on Action T4 with the working title Stumbling Over History, Disability and the Holocaust, fragments of which have been presented and published in the New York Times and Kraft, and as a video series, What Happened Here in the Summer of 1940. And what Kenny does is he doesn't use his artistic imagination to fill in the gaps in the stories of the victims, but I'd rather compare his work to that of a guide through the circles of dark hell of history, who poses a number of questions to consider when thinking about its links with the present. And then I think that this is, again, something that Kenny shares in common with Perel and their talk show, in which we're going to participate today. And I would like to end with a very basic conclusion. So it seems central to the post-humanist remembrance and commemoration of the victims of Nazi euthanasia is representation. And disability scholar Michael Berube claims that representation has double valence for disability studies. So on the one hand, disability representation refers to the ways in which disability and disabled individuals are represented in culture. And the major question that needs to be addressed from the point of view of contemporary disability studies is, how do we present the lives of patients of mental institutions, including those who are dependent and less agential, as life worthy of life? And some answers, I think, have been provided by the projects that I have discussed today. Other answers showed that some official mainstream narratives are really capacious enough to accommodate these stories. But the word representation also refers to the idea of having one's representation and representatives in a given field, here in culture, more specifically remembrance culture. And the so understood representation is kind of essential to reclaiming the past by members of disability communities, which helps build that those communities and disability identity. And this is, at the same time, it offers valuable critical perspective on the present and the past, helping us reconsider our understanding of disability and our understanding of what it means to be human. And I think I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kasia, for this amazing and rich and really mind-blowing presentation and lecture. I believe we'll have quite some time for discussion. And as I believe the microphones are still not that much working.
So I should turn off my mic, right?
Please. encourage people in the room, but also on the Zoom to ask questions. If you participate on Zoom, you can just type your questions into the chat, but also raise your hand and ask question like with your voice. Any questions?
I can also take questions after the second part if you need time to digest what I've just said.
Actually, I believe I have a question. You discussed some examples of commemorating and doing research on this traumatic and difficult history by scholars with disabilities. And my question is regarding your experience as a scholar without disability. How do you approach this task? Because what I got from your presentation is that the experience of disability gives you some access in a situation that you don't have sources, that there is this space for comparison of experience of your own, of the researcher with disability, or there is a relation to the child with disability that you have contact with, that is your child. So my question is how to navigate this as a person without this experience, as a researcher without this experience.
Without the experience of disability,
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
but I think that's, I think it's more about...
there is mic off.
Should I turn on my mic?
I believe that
Can you hear me? Yeah. Yep. Actually, I think it is. Can I move over here because I can hear myself and I cannot properly focus. The way I can relate to this history and to these experiences, it is just from my own experience of social exclusion and marginalization. I think that this is the way, really. This is it is all about like building bridges across various forms of stigmatization and exclusion. And this is also the only way to create a kind of community that will capable of resisting the injustice.
Thank you. Other the questions online, maybe in chat? No. Okay, I think there is a lot of to digest. Yeah, and we will meet in the same Zoom room in 15-20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kasia.